The winter rain hammered against the windshield as Ethan Cole drove alone through the outskirts of Chicago. The city lights behind him looked cold and distant, like memories he no longer trusted. At 36 years old, Ethan had everything most Americans spent their lives chasing. He owned luxury hotels across Texas, Florida, and Illinois. He sat on charity boards beside governors and senators. His penthouse overlooked Lake Michigan, and his private security team treated him like a president. Yet none of it touched the loneliness growing quietly inside him. Women surrounded Ethan constantly. At business galas in Houston, charity dinners in Atlanta, and rooftop parties in Los Angeles, they smiled too quickly whenever he entered a room. He could already predict the conversations before they began. First came admiration, then came curiosity about his companies, his investments, his homes, and eventually his money. Some women hid their intentions carefully. Others barely bothered pretending. Ethan had once believed real love still existed somewhere beneath the performances. Years of disappointment slowly destroyed that belief. One Friday evening, he hosted a private dinner inside his downtown Chicago penthouse. Snow drifted outside the enormous windows while jazz music played softly through hidden speakers. Across the table sat Vanessa Hart, a beautiful social media personality from Miami who had spent the evening complimenting his intelligence and kindness. Ethan almost allowed himself to relax. Then Vanessa leaned forward with a rehearsed smile and showed him a photograph on her phone. "I saw this necklace yesterday," she whispered playfully. "It costs almost $70,000, but honestly, you could buy it without noticing." Ethan stared silently at the glowing screen. Vanessa mistook his silence for hesitation and touched his hand gently. "If a man truly cares about a woman," she continued, "he should spoil her a little." Something inside Ethan went numb. Not angry, not shocked, just exhausted. After she left, Ethan remained alone beside the dark windows overlooking the frozen city. The expensive furniture around him suddenly felt lifeless. The silence inside the penthouse seemed heavier than the storm outside. He loosened his tie slowly and sat in the darkness without moving. For years, people admired his wealth while ignoring the man carrying it. They praised his success without ever asking about his fears, regrets, or loneliness. Ethan realized he no longer knew whether anybody could truly love him without the power surrounding his name. That night, a dangerous idea entered his mind. What if he disappeared completely from his privileged world? What if he stepped into ordinary American life without wealth, status, or protection? He wanted to stand where working men stood every day. He wanted to hear how strangers treated someone without influence. Most importantly, he wanted to know whether genuine love could survive without money attached to it. The next morning, Ethan called Marcus Reed, the only person outside his family whom he trusted completely. Marcus had worked beside Ethan's father for decades before helping Ethan build his business empire. Calm, loyal, and brutally honest, Marcus understood Ethan better than anyone else alive. When Ethan explained his plan, Marcus stared at him across the office in disbelief. "You want to become a bus worker?" Marcus asked slowly. "Not here in Chicago," Ethan replied. "Somewhere nobody recognizes me. Somewhere rough enough that money means nothing." Marcus rubbed his forehead tiredly. "This sounds insane." Ethan nodded quietly. "Maybe insanity is the only way I find something real again." Marcus studied him carefully before sighing heavily. He already knew arguing would change nothing. Within days, Marcus arranged everything in Cleveland, Ohio. Busy enough for anonymity, hard enough for reality. Ethan rented a tiny room above an old laundromat on the east side. He exchanged tailored suits for faded hoodies and worn jeans. He stopped shaving carefully. He removed his expensive watch and wedding ring-shaped family heirloom. When he finally looked into the cracked bathroom mirror, he barely recognized himself. Marcus found him work assisting drivers on an aging public commuter route crossing Cleveland's industrial neighborhoods. The buses smelled like sweat, gasoline, and winter boots soaked by snow. Ethan learned quickly that ordinary people carried invisible exhaustion everywhere. Construction workers boarded before sunrise with aching backs. Single mothers balanced grocery bags while calming crying children. Elderly veterans counted coins carefully before paying fares. Nobody cared about Ethan Cole, billionaire hotel owner. To them, he was simply another struggling worker trying to survive. His first week nearly broke him. Angry passengers cursed him over delayed stops. Drunk men mocked him openly. One teenager nearly punched him after accusing him of stealing change. Ethan returned to his tiny apartment every night physically destroyed. His shoulders burned from standing constantly, his throat hurt from shouting over traffic noise. Sometimes he collapsed onto the mattress fully dressed because exhaustion overpowered everything else. Yet beneath the hardship, something unexpected awakened inside him. For the first time in years, people spoke honestly around him. Nobody flattered him. Nobody tried manipulating him for advantage. Life felt brutal but strangely authentic. Ethan began noticing details he had ignored during his privileged life. He saw workers eating cheap sandwiches during 10-minute breaks because proper meals cost too much. He watched exhausted nurses travel 2 hours home after overnight hospital shifts. He listened to immigrants discussing rent payments and medical bills with quiet desperation. One freezing evening, Ethan stood beside the bus doors watching snow fall over downtown Cleveland. His hands were cracked from cold weather and constant work. A driver beside him laughed while smoking a cigarette. "Rough life, huh?" the driver joked. Ethan looked at the crowded streets thoughtfully before answering. "Hard," he admitted quietly, "but honest." At that exact moment, across the snowy station platform, Ethan noticed a young woman standing alone beneath a flickering street lamp. She wore a simple dark coat and held a worn paperback novel against her chest. Unlike everyone rushing angrily through the storm, she seemed strangely calm. Their eyes met briefly through the falling snow. Then the bus doors closed between them, and she disappeared into the winter night before Ethan could move. For reasons he could not explain, Ethan kept thinking about her long after the route ended. The next morning arrived wrapped in freezing fog, drifting across Cleveland's industrial district. Ethan climbed onto the crowded city bus before sunrise, already exhausted despite the early hour. His body still ached from the previous week's brutal schedule. Every muscle reminded him he no longer lived inside luxury and comfort. Yet something deeper kept him returning each morning. By 6:30, the bus was already packed with factory workers and hospital staff heading toward downtown. People entered carrying thermoses, lunch containers, and tired expressions. Some barely spoke, others argued loudly over seats and delays. Ethan moved through the narrow aisle, collecting fares, while balancing himself against sudden turns and potholes. His faded jacket smelled permanently of cold air and diesel fuel. During one stop near the old steel district, an elderly black veteran entered slowly using a cane. The man searched through trembling fingers for exact fare while impatient passengers groaned behind him. Ethan noticed the veteran was short almost $2. Before Ethan could decide what to do, a soft female voice spoke from the back. "I can cover the difference." Ethan turned immediately. It was the woman from the snowy station platform the previous night. Up close, she looked even more striking in her simplicity. Her dark brown eyes carried quiet intelligence rather than performance. She stepped forward calmly and handed Ethan the extra cash without expecting attention. "Thank you, ma'am," the veteran whispered gratefully. She smiled gently. "Everybody needs help sometimes." Ethan watched her return to her seat beside the fogged window. Most passengers ignored moments like this completely. Some people would have complained about delays instead of helping, yet she acted naturally, as though kindness required no announcement. Throughout the route, Ethan found himself noticing her constantly. She read quietly during long traffic stops. She thanked him sincerely whenever he returned change. She never rolled her eyes impatiently or treated him like invisible staff. Small details mattered more than she probably realized. Near downtown, the bus hit a deep pothole hidden beneath dirty snow. Several passengers stumbled violently. The young woman nearly lost balance while standing near the exit. Ethan reacted instantly, catching her arm firmly before she fell against the metal railing. "Careful," he said sharply, more frightened than angry. For one brief moment, neither moved. Cold air rushed through the opening doors while traffic roared outside. Then she steadied herself and smiled softly. "Guess you saved me today," she joked. Ethan released her arm carefully. "Part of the job." "Still," she replied, adjusting her scarf, "most people wouldn't react that quickly anymore." Before leaving, she paused beside the doorway. I'm Claire, by the way. Ethan, he answered automatically before realizing he probably should have used a fake name. Yet something about her honesty made lying feel difficult. Nice meeting you, Ethan. Then she disappeared into the crowded sidewalk outside. For the rest of the day, Ethan could not stop replaying the conversation inside his head. It had lasted less than 2 minutes, yet it felt more genuine than entire relationships from his former life. Over the following weeks, Claire became a regular passenger on Ethan's route. She worked at a small independent bookstore near downtown Cleveland and often carried stacks of discounted novels inside her bag. Sometimes she boarded early mornings looking sleepy and wrapped tightly against the freezing weather. Other evenings, she returned exhausted after long shifts but still greeted Ethan politely. Their conversations remained simple at first. Weather, traffic, difficult passengers, everyday frustrations ordinary people shared. Yet gradually deeper pieces of themselves surfaced naturally. One evening during heavy snowfall, Ethan learned Claire lived with her widowed mother in a modest apartment outside the city. Medical bills from her father's illness had nearly destroyed their finances years earlier. Since graduating community college, Claire worked constantly to help keep them afloat. Most people think bookstores are peaceful, she laughed quietly while snow streaked the windows beside them. Truthfully, half my day involves arguing with customers about coffee prices. Ethan smiled genuinely. Sounds familiar. You actually seem calmer than most drivers around here, she observed thoughtfully. Maybe I'm still learning how people work, he admitted. Claire studied him curiously after that answer. More than once, she noticed strange contradictions surrounding him. His clothes looked rough enough. His apartment stories sounded believable enough. Yet certain things about Ethan felt unusual. The way he spoke carefully. The way anger rarely controlled him. The way he listened fully before responding. One afternoon, Ethan invited Claire for coffee after her shift ended. He chose a tiny diner near Lake Erie where exhausted workers gathered late evenings. The coffee tasted terrible, and the heating system barely functioned properly. Yet Claire seemed completely comfortable there. They talked for almost 2 hours. Claire spoke about growing up in Ohio during difficult years after factories closed. She remembered neighbors losing homes after layoffs. She remembered her father working double shifts while hiding chest pains because health insurance barely covered treatment. Ethan listened silently, realizing how little he truly understood ordinary American struggle before coming here. Eventually, Claire asked about his own life. Ethan hesitated carefully. Nothing dramatic, he answered slowly, just trying to survive like everybody else. She looked unconvinced, but respected his privacy. Later, while walking her toward the train station, Claire stopped suddenly beneath a flickering streetlight. Can I ask something honestly? Sure. Why do you always seem sad? The question struck Ethan harder than expected. Wealthy women from his old world rarely asked about emotions unless performing concern. Claire asked quietly because she genuinely noticed. Snow drifted around them while Ethan searched for an answer. Maybe, he said finally, because people usually care more about what I can give them than who I actually am. Claire stared at him thoughtfully before responding. Then maybe you've spent time around the wrong people. Those words followed Ethan home that night like warmth through winter darkness. Weeks passed. Their connection deepened naturally through ordinary moments. Claire occasionally brought Ethan coffee during freezing shifts. Ethan helped carry bookstore inventory after closing hours. Sometimes they walked silently beside Lake Erie, discussing nothing important at all. For the first time in years, Ethan began feeling hopeful again. Then reality reminded him why he created this entire experiment. One Friday evening, Claire introduced Ethan to 2 co-workers outside the bookstore after closing. One woman greeted him kindly enough. The other, a sharply dressed sales associate named Brittany, openly looked him over with amusement. So this is your bus guy? Brittany asked Claire carelessly. Claire frowned immediately. His name is Ethan. Brittany shrugged dismissively. I'm just surprised. You're smart and beautiful. I figured you'd date somebody with actual ambition. Ethan remained silent. He had heard worse countless times already. But Claire's expression hardened instantly. You don't know anything about him, she replied coldly. Brittany laughed. Come on, Claire. The guy works public transit. You really see a future there. Claire stepped closer beside Ethan, without hesitation. "I see somebody kind," she answered firmly. "Honestly, that's rarer than money these days." Brittany rolled her eyes before leaving awkwardly with the other co-worker. For several moments, silence hung between Ethan and Claire beneath the bookstore lights. Then Ethan looked at her quietly. "You didn't have to defend me." Claire shrugged softly. "Yes, I did." Something inside Ethan shifted deeply after hearing those words. That same night, alone inside his tiny apartment above the laundromat, Ethan realized his experiment was becoming dangerous. He was no longer observing emotions from a safe distance. He was falling in love with her. Spring arrived slowly across Cleveland. Dirty snow disappeared from sidewalks, replaced by cold rain and gray skies hanging above the city. Ethan still worked exhausting routes every day, but life no longer felt empty. Claire had quietly become part of his routine in ways neither expected. Some mornings she boarded carrying coffee for both of them. Other evenings she waited after work just to walk beside him toward the train station. Their conversations grew deeper naturally, built through repetition and trust rather than dramatic declarations. One rainy Thursday evening, Ethan finally invited Claire to his apartment. He hesitated before asking. The place embarrassed him despite everything he had experienced recently. The building smelled permanently of detergent, cigarette smoke, and leaking pipes. Children screamed constantly through thin walls. Elderly tenants argued loudly in hallways late at night. Still, Claire agreed. When she arrived, Ethan opened the door nervously. The room was painfully small. One narrow bed, a folding table beside the window, two mismatched chairs, a tiny refrigerator humming loudly in the corner. Yet despite the poverty surrounding it, the space remained clean and organized. Claire looked around quietly without judgment. "Sorry," Ethan said awkwardly. "It's not much." She placed her coat carefully across the chair. "It's home," she answered simply. That response hit Ethan harder than expected. They spent the evening eating cheap takeout noodles while rain hammered against the old windows. For the first time since arriving in Cleveland, Ethan allowed himself to speak more honestly. He described the humiliation transit workers faced daily, the insults from angry passengers, the endless exhaustion, the fear many working-class Americans carried constantly regarding rent, healthcare, and survival. "Most people don't even see workers like us," he admitted quietly. "We're background noise to them." Claire listened carefully before responding. "My father used to say dignity isn't connected to income," she said softly. "He believed honest work matters more than status." Ethan studied her face thoughtfully. "Do you really believe that?" Claire looked genuinely confused by the question. "Of course. Why wouldn't I?" Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. "Because most people don't." Silence settled between them while distant sirens echoed outside. Finally, Claire asked carefully, "Who hurt you before me?" Ethan almost laughed at the painful accuracy of that question. "A lot of people," he admitted. She nodded slowly without pressing further. That night changed everything between them. Afterward, their connection deepened beyond simple attraction. Claire began trusting Ethan with pieces of herself she rarely shared openly. She told him about watching her father die slowly from untreated heart complications because insurance refused certain procedures. She admitted fearing poverty more than loneliness because poverty destroys dignity first. Ethan listened silently, carrying growing guilt inside his chest. He owned hospitals through corporate investments. Insurance executives attended his business conferences regularly. For years, suffering like Claire's existed far away from his personal reality. Now it sat directly beside him. Weeks later, Claire invited Ethan to dinner with her mother. The small apartment smelled warmly of garlic bread and tomato soup when Ethan arrived carrying flowers from a street vendor. Claire's mother, Margaret, greeted him kindly despite obvious curiosity. During dinner, Ethan noticed how tightly the women managed expenses. Furniture looked worn but carefully maintained. Half the kitchen appliances barely functioned properly. Medical prescription bottles lined one shelf near the sink. Yet despite financial hardship, laughter still existed there. Margaret asked thoughtful questions about Ethan's work without sounding judgmental. Claire teased him affectionately whenever he became too serious. For the first time in years, Ethan experienced something painfully unfamiliar. A real family dinner. Not catered perfection inside luxury dining rooms. Not strategic conversations disguised as social gatherings, just warmth. Driving home afterward on nearly empty streets, Ethan suddenly realized he no longer wanted the experiment to end. That realization terrified him, because every passing day made the truth harder to reveal. The deception already stretched too far. One Sunday afternoon, Ethan finally called Marcus from outside his apartment building. "I think I found her," he admitted quietly. Marcus remained silent briefly before asking the important question. "Does she know who you really are?" Ethan closed his eyes tiredly. "Not yet." "Then this gets dangerous now." "I know." Marcus sighed heavily through the phone. "Ethan, you're crossing a line. Testing people is one thing. Letting somebody genuinely love a false version of you becomes something else entirely." Ethan knew Marcus was right. Still, fear controlled him. What if revealing the truth destroyed everything immediately? What if Claire changed completely after discovering his wealth? What if her kindness disappeared the same way others' kindness always disappeared once money entered the equation? Yet another fear slowly became stronger. What if he hurt the only honest woman he had ever truly loved? That internal conflict grew unbearable. Then life complicated matters further. One evening, after finishing work, Ethan and Claire sat beside Lake Erie, watching waves crash violently against the shore. Cold wind whipped Claire's hair across her face, while city lights reflected across dark water. Without warning, Claire reached for his hand. "I love you," she said quietly. Ethan stopped breathing for one terrible second. No woman had ever spoken those words to him without calculation attached somewhere beneath them. Claire wasn't asking for anything. She wasn't performing emotion. She simply meant it. Ethan stared at the lake silently while panic and love collided inside his chest. Finally, he squeezed her hand gently. "Claire," he whispered painfully, "there's something you don't know about me." She looked at him carefully. "Then tell me." But before Ethan could speak, his phone rang loudly inside his jacket pocket. Marcus. Ethan almost ignored the call until he noticed Marcus never contacted him during work hours unless absolutely necessary. He answered immediately. "What happened?" Marcus sounded tense. "Your father found out where you are." Ethan's blood went cold instantly. "How?" "One of the Chicago board members recognized you in Cleveland last week. Your family knows everything now." Claire watched Ethan's face change with growing concern. "Ethan, what's wrong?" He barely heard her. Marcus continued speaking urgently. "Your father wants you back immediately. He's threatening legal action regarding several company contracts unless you return home tomorrow." Ethan stared across the freezing lake while dread settled heavily inside him, because he knew his father well enough to understand one terrible truth. Once Charles Cole entered this situation, nothing would remain simple anymore. Ethan barely slept that night. Rain tapped endlessly against the apartment windows while Claire slept beside him peacefully, unaware that everything around them was beginning to collapse. Ethan lay awake staring into darkness, replaying Marcus's warning repeatedly inside his mind. His father never made empty threats. Charles Cole built one of the most powerful hospitality empires in America through ruthless discipline and absolute control. He respected strength, image, and legacy above everything else. Emotional decisions disgusted him. The moment he discovered Ethan living like an ordinary transit worker beside an unknown bookstore employee, disaster became inevitable. Before sunrise, Ethan quietly dressed for work while Claire remained asleep beneath thin blankets. She opened her eyes just as he reached the doorway. "You're leaving already?" Ethan forced a tired smile. "Early shift today." Claire studied him carefully from the bed. "Something feels wrong." He hesitated painfully. "I'll explain soon," he promised softly. She nodded slowly, though uncertainty remained visible across her face. Outside, cold wind swept trash through empty streets while Ethan walked toward the bus depot. Every step felt heavier than usual. Marcus arrived in Cleveland by noon. The older man looked exhausted when Ethan met him behind the transit station during lunch break. "How bad is it?" Ethan asked immediately. Marcus rubbed his forehead wearily. "Your father already contacted half the executive board. He's furious." "About what, exactly?" Marcus stared at him incredulously. "Ethan, You vanished from a billion-dollar corporation for 3 months pretending to be a bus worker. Investors think you're having a psychological breakdown." Ethan looked away silently. Marcus lowered his voice carefully. "And your father thinks this woman manipulated you somehow." Anger flashed instantly across Ethan's face. "Claire doesn't even know who I am." That won't matter to him. Ethan already knew that. Charles Cole viewed relationships strategically. Wealthy families connected with wealthy families. Marriage strengthened influence. Love existed somewhere far beneath practical considerations. Marcus handed Ethan a folded newspaper article. The headline nearly stopped his heart. "Coal Enterprise heir missing amid corporate instability." Below the article sat a photograph of Ethan from a Chicago business conference 6 months earlier. "People are starting to ask questions publicly now," Marcus explained quietly. "You can't stay hidden much longer, Kay." Ethan crumpled the paper slowly inside his fist. That evening, he finally made a decision. Claire deserved the truth before someone else revealed it cruelly. After her bookstore shift ended, Ethan asked her to walk with him beside the waterfront again. Storm clouds rolled heavily above Lake Erie, while freezing waves crashed violently against concrete barriers. Claire immediately noticed his tension. "Okay," she said carefully, "you're scaring me now." Ethan stopped walking beneath a flickering street lamp. For several seconds, he could not speak. "How do you confess that nearly every detail about your life has been false?" "Claire," he began hoarsely, "everything between us has been real for me. Every feeling, every moment. But I haven't been honest about who I am." Her expression changed instantly. "What does that mean?" Ethan took a long breath. "My name really is Ethan Cole, but I'm not a transit worker." Silence. Only wind and crashing water filled the darkness around them. "Then who are you?" Claire whispered. Ethan forced himself to continue. "My family owns coal enterprises, hotels, resorts, real estate developments across several states." Claire stared at him blankly. At first, she genuinely thought he was joking. Then she noticed the pain inside his eyes. And suddenly, everything strange about him made terrible sense. The way he spoke, the way he carried himself, the controlled anger, the intelligence hidden beneath rough clothes. Claire stepped backward slowly. "No," she whispered. "Claire, please let me explain. You lied to me." Her voice cracked sharply now. "For months. I never meant to hurt you." She laughed bitterly through sudden tears. "Then what exactly did you mean to do?" Ethan felt panic rising rapidly. "I was lonely," he admitted desperately. "I needed to know whether somebody could love me without money attached to it." Claire looked genuinely wounded. "So I was part of some experiment?" "No, not anymore. But it started that way." Ethan could not deny it. Claire turned away sharply, wiping tears from her face while freezing rain began falling around them. "You let me trust you," she whispered painfully. "You met my mother. You sat inside our home knowing I had no idea who you really were." "Because I fell in love with you," Ethan said desperately. Claire shook her head slowly. "I defended you when people mocked your job. I believed every story you told me." Each sentence cut deeper because every word was true. Ethan stepped closer carefully. "Claire, listen to me. What I feel for you is the only honest thing I've had in years." She looked at him with tears mixing into rainwater across her face. "You should have trusted me enough to tell the truth sooner." For several terrible moments, neither moved. Finally, Claire spoke quietly. "I need time." Then she walked away through the rain without looking back. Ethan stood alone beside the lake long after she disappeared. For the first time since arriving in Cleveland, he truly understood the damage his deception caused. Not because Claire cared about his wealth, because trust mattered more than money ever could. The following week became unbearable. Claire stopped taking Ethan's bus route completely. She ignored his calls. Her bookstore manager informed Ethan politely that Claire requested no visitors. Meanwhile, pressure from Chicago intensified daily. Charles Cole demanded Ethan return home immediately for emergency board meetings regarding collapsing investor confidence. Financial journalists already speculated publicly about instability inside the company. Eventually, Ethan realized he could not avoid reality any longer. 3 days later, he packed his small apartment silently while Marcus waited downstairs beside a black luxury SUV. Before leaving Cleveland, Ethan made one final stop outside Claire's bookstore. Through the front windows, he saw her arranging novels quietly beneath warm yellow lights. For one painful moment, he almost entered. But Claire looked exhausted and emotionally fragile already. Maybe seeing him again would only deepen the wound. So Ethan remained hidden across the street instead. As he turned away toward the waiting SUV, he noticed something that stopped him cold. A tall man wearing an expensive navy coat had just entered the bookstore. Claire smiled politely at first. Then her expression changed completely. Shock, fear, recognition. The man leaned closer, speaking low enough that Ethan could not hear. But Ethan recognized him instantly. Charles Cole's personal attorney. And suddenly, Ethan understood his father had never intended to leave Claire alone. Ethan reached Chicago before sunrise. The city looked exactly as he remembered. Glass towers glowing above Lake Michigan, black cars sliding silently through empty streets, security guards opening doors before anyone touched them. Wealth surrounded him immediately again, but instead of comfort, it felt suffocating. Inside the Cole family mansion, overlooking the northern shoreline, his father waited beside enormous windows holding a glass of bourbon. Charles Cole did not hug his son. He simply turned slowly and studied Ethan with controlled disappointment. "You look terrible," he said finally. Ethan ignored the comment. "Why did you send Richard to Cleveland?" Charles remained calm. "Because somebody needed to clean up your mess." Anger surged instantly through Ethan. "Claire isn't part of corporate damage control." "No," Charles replied coldly. "She's the reason investors believe my son abandoned his responsibilities." Ethan stepped closer. "You had no right approaching her." Charles finally faced him directly. "And you had no right disappearing from a billion-dollar company to play working-class fantasy games." His voice hardened sharply. "Do you understand what you've risked? Board members are panicking. Contracts are stalling. Reporters smell weakness." Ethan laughed bitterly. "So that's what matters most to you?" Charles set down the glass carefully. "What matters is preserving the empire your grandfather built and I expanded. Men depend on this company. Thousands of families depend on us remaining stable." Ethan stared silently. His father always framed power as responsibility, maybe partly because he genuinely believed it. Yet somewhere along the way, compassion disappeared beneath ambition. Later that afternoon, Ethan attended his first executive meeting in months. The boardroom overlooked downtown Chicago through massive windows stretching floor to ceiling. Wealthy investors and senior executives greeted him cautiously. Some looked relieved, others looked suspicious. Every conversation felt fake again. People complimented his return while quietly calculating how instability affected profits. Nobody asked whether he was emotionally all right. Nobody cared why he vanished. By evening, Ethan already missed Cleveland desperately. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Claire sat alone inside her mother's apartment, replaying Richard Lawson's visit repeatedly inside her mind. The attorney had been polite, too polite. That made everything worse. He explained Ethan's background carefully while offering vague warnings about media attention and public scrutiny. Richard never directly threatened Claire, yet the implication remained painfully clear. The Cole family considered her a problem needing containment. Claire felt humiliated, not because Ethan was wealthy, because powerful strangers now viewed her private heartbreak like corporate inconvenience. Margaret noticed immediately that something deeper was wrong. "Honey," she asked gently during dinner, "who exactly is Ethan?" Claire stared silently at untouched soup before finally answering, "Somebody I never really knew." Days passed heavily afterward. Claire tried focusing on work, but concentration became impossible. Customers' conversations blurred together meaninglessly. Every bus passing outside reminded her painfully of Ethan. Despite her anger, she missed him constantly. That frightened her most. One rainy evening after closing the bookstore, Claire walked alone toward the station, carrying leftover inventory receipts. Halfway there, a black luxury car stopped beside the sidewalk unexpectedly. Her stomach tightened immediately. The rear window lowered slowly. Ethan sat inside. For several seconds, neither spoke. Finally, Ethan stepped out into the rain, wearing an expensive charcoal coat that probably cost more than Claire earned monthly. The contrast between his current appearance and the man she loved hurt almost physically. Yet despite the wealth surrounding him, his eyes still looked exhausted. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. Claire crossed her arms defensively. "Your attorney already talked enough." Pain flashed across Ethan's face. "I didn't send him." "But your family did." He nodded bitterly. "Yeah, they did." Rainwater soaked both of them while traffic hissed through nearby streets. Finally, Claire whispered the question haunting her constantly. "Was any part of us real?" Ethan stepped closer carefully. "Every part. Even the apartment? Real. The bus routes? Real. The nights you spent listening to my fears?" Ethan's voice broke slightly. "Claire, those were the most honest moments of my life." She wanted desperately not to believe him. That would have been easier. Yet his pain looked genuine. Claire looked away toward blurred city lights. "I don't understand why somebody with everything would choose that life voluntarily." Ethan laughed quietly without humor, because having everything isn't the same as having peace. Silence stretched again. Then Ethan confessed something he had never admitted aloud before. "Before Cleveland, I honestly believed most people only loved me for money. I stopped trusting everyone." Claire studied him carefully. "And now?" "Now I know I became so afraid of being used that I hurt the first person who actually cared about me." Those words shattered something defensive inside Claire, not completely, but enough. Over the following weeks, Ethan continued visiting Cleveland quietly, despite growing pressure from Chicago. He never pushed Claire aggressively. Sometimes they simply walked beside the lake, discussing ordinary things again. Trust rebuilt slowly, painfully, yet genuine love remained beneath the damage. Then Ethan made another terrible mistake. During a massive corporate gala inside one of Cole Enterprises' luxury hotels, Charles introduced Ethan publicly to Victoria Sinclair. Beautiful, wealthy, educated at elite private schools. Daughter of a powerful New York real estate developer. Everything Charles considered appropriate. Victoria smiled elegantly while photographers captured images beside enormous crystal chandeliers. "I've heard so much about you," she told Ethan smoothly. Ethan barely listened. Across the ballroom, Charles watched carefully. Later that night, father and son argued privately inside the hotel office. "You're seriously arranging dates now?" Ethan demanded. Charles remained completely calm. "Victoria understands our world. Claire understands me." His father's expression hardened immediately. "Claire is a bookstore employee from Cleveland. She's also the best person I've ever known." Charles sighed heavily, like speaking to a stubborn child. "Love fades. Stability matters longer." Ethan stared at his father in disbelief. "Is that what happened to you?" For the first time, something almost vulnerable crossed Charles Cole's face. Then it vanished. "You don't understand sacrifice yet," he replied quietly. The next morning, entertainment websites exploded with photographs of Ethan beside Victoria Sinclair. Headlines immediately labeled them America's newest corporate power couple. Claire saw the articles during lunch break, and suddenly every fragile piece of trust she rebuilt began collapsing all over again. Claire stared at the article on her phone until the screen blurred. Ethan Cole and Victoria Sinclair. Spark engagement rumors. The photograph beneath the headline looked perfect. Ethan standing beside a glamorous woman in a silver evening gown beneath crystal chandeliers. Wealth, elegance, power. The exact world Claire suddenly realized she could never truly belong to. Customers moved through the bookstore around her while humiliation settled heavily inside her chest. Maybe she had been foolish all along. Maybe Ethan genuinely cared about her once. But eventually men like him always returned to women like Victoria. Women raised inside wealth. Women fitting perfectly beside billionaires during public events. Not bookstore employees from struggling Cleveland neighborhoods. That evening, Ethan arrived outside the bookstore smiling faintly, unaware that everything had changed again. Claire walked past him immediately. "Claire," she kept moving toward the station. Ethan caught up quickly beside the sidewalk. "What's wrong?" Claire turned sharply, eyes burning with hurt. "You tell me." Then she shoved the article toward him. Ethan's expression darkened instantly. "This isn't what it looks like." Claire laughed bitterly. "Really? because it looks exactly like a billionaire returning to his real life. Victoria means nothing to me. But your family means everything, apparently. Ethan reached for her hand desperately. Claire, listen to me. My father arranged that entire event. She pulled away immediately. And you still stood there smiling beside her while cameras flashed everywhere. Rain began falling lightly again, turning city lights soft and distorted. What was I supposed to do? Cause a scene in front of investors and reporters? Claire stared at him painfully. Maybe tell the truth for once. That sentence silenced him completely, because deep down, Ethan knew she was right. For months, he allowed powerful people to control the narrative around his life while expecting Claire to trust him completely. Claire stepped backward slowly. I can't survive inside your world, Ethan. You don't have to. Yes, I do, because your world follows you everywhere. She turned away before tears became visible. This time, Ethan didn't chase her. He stood motionless beneath cold rain while she disappeared into the station crowd. 3 days later, Claire made another discovery that changed everything. She was pregnant. The realization hit quietly at first. Exhaustion, nausea, missed dates she originally blamed on stress. Then came confirmation inside a small neighborhood clinic. Claire sat frozen while the nurse smiled warmly across the desk. Congratulations, the woman said gently. Claire could barely breathe, pregnant. With Ethan's child, fear arrived immediately afterward. Not fear of motherhood, fear of Ethan's world swallowing the child before it even entered life. That night, Claire told only one person, her closest friend, Naomi. Naomi reacted exactly how Claire expected. You have to tell him immediately. Claire shook her head instantly. No. Claire, are you serious right now? He already has enough chaos around him. Naomi stared incredulously. He's the father. Claire looked down silently at her trembling hands. And his family already thinks I'm some manipulative problem from Cleveland. Imagine what happens after this. Naomi softened slightly. What do you want to do? Claire answered honestly. I don't know. Over the following month, pressure inside Ethan's life intensified dramatically. Charles Cole accelerated public appearances with Victoria Sinclair despite Ethan's obvious resistance. Business magazines praised the potential partnership between two powerful families. Investors relaxed visibly. Meanwhile, Ethan deteriorated emotionally. He stopped sleeping properly. He argued constantly with his father. Most nights he drove alone through Chicago for hours, remembering Cleveland's streets and Claire's laughter beside Lake Erie. Marcus watched everything with growing concern. One evening, he finally confronted Ethan directly. You're destroying yourself. Ethan sat inside his penthouse staring across the dark city. Maybe I deserve it. Marcus sighed heavily. Have you actually told your father you love Claire? Ethan laughed quietly. He thinks love is temporary chemical weakness. Then maybe stop asking permission from somebody incapable of understanding you. Those words stayed with Ethan afterward, because despite all his wealth and influence, he still behaved like a son desperate for paternal approval. 2 weeks later, Charles organized a private family dinner involving Victoria and her parents. The evening became unbearable almost immediately. Victoria discussed luxury properties and European vacations enthusiastically, while Charles praised her intelligence and sophistication. Ethan barely touched his food. At one point, Victoria smiled elegantly across the table. Your father says you spent months traveling anonymously through Ohio. Charles chuckled dismissively. A temporary identity crisis. Something inside Ethan snapped finally. He set down his glass sharply. No, he said coldly. It was the first honest period of my adult life. Silence crashed across the table. Charles stared warningly, but Ethan continued. While you people spent years discussing acquisitions and appearances, ordinary Americans were drowning financially. I finally saw it myself. Victoria looked uncomfortable immediately. Her father cleared his throat awkwardly. Charles spoke through clenched teeth. This isn't appropriate dinner conversation. Ethan laughed bitterly. Truth rarely feels appropriate in this family. Then he stood abruptly and walked out. That same night, Ethan drove 6 hours back toward Cleveland without warning anyone. He reached Claire's apartment building shortly after midnight. Lights still glowed faintly through the kitchen curtains. Heart pounding violently, Ethan climbed the narrow stairs and knocked softly. Claire opened the door wearing oversized pajamas and immediate shock across her face. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Ethan finally admitted the truth he avoided for weeks. "I can't do this anymore," he whispered painfully. "I can't pretend another woman belongs beside me while the only person I actually love lives here." Claire stared at him silently. Ethan stepped closer carefully. "I know I hurt you. I know trusting me feels impossible sometimes. But Claire, nothing about Chicago feels real anymore without you." Tears gathered slowly inside her eyes, because despite everything, she still loved him too. Then Ethan noticed something unusual. Claire looked pale, exhausted, and suddenly protective. One hand rested unconsciously against her stomach. A terrible realization flashed through him instantly. "Claire," he whispered slowly, "is there something you're not telling me?" Claire closed her eyes briefly. For several seconds, only the sound of distant traffic filled the apartment hallway. Then she stepped aside quietly. "Come inside." Ethan entered slowly, tension visible across every movement. The apartment looked exactly as he remembered. Small kitchen, old furniture, warm yellow lighting. Yet tonight the atmosphere felt heavier somehow. Claire sat carefully on the couch without speaking. Ethan remained standing. Finally, he asked again, "Are you pregnant?" Claire looked down at her hands. "Yes." The word hit Ethan like physical force. He sat beside her slowly, unable to process everything immediately. "How far along?" "Almost 3 months." Ethan stared ahead silently while emotions collided violently inside him. Shock, fear, joy, guilt, most painfully, regret. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked softly. Claire laughed bitterly without humor. "Tell you when, exactly? While your family pushed you toward another woman in front of cameras." Ethan lowered his eyes. She continued quietly. "I didn't want your father believing I trapped you with a baby." That sentence broke something inside Ethan completely, because he knew his father would absolutely think exactly that. Ethan reached for Claire's trembling hand. "Listen to me carefully," he said firmly. "Nothing about this child changes how much I love you." Tears slipped down Claire's face immediately. "Your world destroys everything simple, Ethan." "Then maybe I need to leave that world behind." Claire looked up sharply. "You don't mean that." "I do." For the first time since returning to Chicago, Ethan sounded absolutely certain. The following morning, Ethan finally confronted his father properly. Charles Cole sat inside the executive office, reviewing contracts when Ethan entered without knocking. "We need to talk now." Charles barely looked up. "This better involve business." "Claire is pregnant." Silence. Charles slowly removed his glasses and stared across the office. "Excuse me?" Ethan held his gaze steadily. "I'm going to be a father." Shock crossed Charles Cole's face for the first time in years. Then came anger. "This is exactly what I warned you about." Ethan stepped closer. "No. This is exactly what happens when two people love each other." Charles stood abruptly. "Love has nothing to do with responsibility." "It has everything to do with responsibility." The tension inside the office became suffocating. Charles moved toward the windows overlooking downtown Chicago. "Do you understand the scandal this creates? Investors already believe you're unstable. Now a pregnant bookstore employee appears during engagement negotiations with the Sinclair family." Ethan laughed sharply. "You still care more about headlines than human beings." Charles turned coldly. "I care about protecting everything this family built." "At what cost?" For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, Charles answered quietly. "You think I don't understand sacrifice because you discovered poverty for 3 months?" Ethan frowned slightly. His father rarely spoke personally. Charles walked slowly toward a locked cabinet near the wall. After opening it, he removed an old photograph Ethan had never seen before. A young Charles Cole stood smiling beside a dark-haired woman holding a baby. Not Ethan's mother. Ethan stared in confusion. "Who is that?" Charles looked at the photograph silently before answering. "The woman I loved before marrying your mother." Ethan froze completely. "What?" Charles placed the photograph carefully across the desk. "Her name was Elena Ramirez. She worked 2 jobs in San Antonio while I built my first hotel business. His voice remained calm but distant now. I wanted to marry her. My father threatened to cut me from the company entirely if I did. Ethan suddenly understood. Charles continued quietly, I chose the company instead. Silence filled the office heavily. What happened to her? Ethan asked softly. Charles stared back toward the skyline. She married someone else eventually. For the first time in his life, Ethan saw genuine sadness inside his father's face. Not weakness, regret, decades of it. So that's why you're doing this to me, Ethan whispered. Charles answered honestly. Because I convinced myself sacrificing love was necessary for greatness. If you reject everything I built for your own happiness, then maybe my entire life was wrong. The confession stunned Ethan completely. Suddenly, his father no longer looked powerful. He looked lonely. A man who spent 40 years protecting an empire while secretly grieving the only woman he truly loved. Ethan sat down slowly. Dad, he said quietly, using the word intentionally, I don't want your life. Charles closed his eyes briefly. I know. That evening, Ethan cancelled every public appearance involving Victoria Sinclair. Within hours, business media exploded with rumors. Victoria herself arrived furious at the Cole mansion. Do you understand how humiliating this is? She demanded. Ethan remained calm surprisingly. I never loved you, Victoria. Continuing this would be crueler. She stared at him with wounded pride. You're throwing away an empire for some woman from Ohio. Ethan shook his head. No, I'm finally choosing the right person instead of the right image. Victoria left moments later without another word, but consequences arrived immediately afterward. Several major investors threatened withdrawing support. Financial analysts publicly questioned Ethan's leadership abilities. Charles faced pressure from every direction. Yet something unexpected happened. He stopped fighting his son. 3 days later, Charles quietly asked Ethan for Claire's address. Ethan hesitated instantly. Why? Charles looked older suddenly. Because I spent my entire life becoming the kind of father I once hated. I'd like to fix that before my grandchild arrives. Against instinct, Ethan agreed. The following weekend, Charles Cole traveled personally to Cleveland. No attorneys, no security team, just him. Claire opened the apartment door, expecting Ethan. Instead, she found the most intimidating businessman in America, standing silently beside the hallway light. For one terrifying moment, she thought everything was about to fall apart again. Then Charles Cole surprised her completely. He removed his expensive coat slowly and said the last words Claire ever expected hearing from him. Miss Bennett, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. Claire stood frozen beside the apartment doorway. Charles Cole looked completely different outside luxury boardrooms and television interviews. Without expensive executives surrounding him, he appeared older somehow. Tired, human, still dangerous. Claire instinctively crossed one arm protectively over her stomach. Charles noticed immediately. I understand why you don't trust me, he said quietly. Claire remained cautious. Then why are you here? For several seconds, Charles struggled finding words. A man who negotiated billion-dollar contracts effortlessly suddenly looked uncomfortable speaking honestly. Because my son loves you, he admitted finally. And because I almost destroyed that love out of fear and pride. Claire stared silently. Charles continued carefully. I spent years believing success required sacrifice. I convinced myself protecting power mattered more than protecting people. His eyes lowered briefly. I was wrong. Those 3 words carried enormous weight coming from someone like Charles Cole. Claire slowly stepped aside. You should come in before the neighbors start staring. Inside the small apartment, Charles looked strangely uncomfortable, sitting on old furniture beneath flickering kitchen lights. Yet he made no comments about the cramped space. Margaret emerged from the kitchen moments later and nearly dropped her coffee mug in shock. Charles stood immediately. Mrs. Bennett, he greeted respectfully. Margaret narrowed her eyes carefully. The famous Charles Cole inside my apartment. That's unexpected. A faint smile touched his face briefly. Believe me, this entire situation is unexpected for me too. The tension slowly softened afterward. Charles surprised both women by speaking honestly without corporate rehearsals or manipulation. He admitted pressuring Ethan unfairly. He admitted valuing image over happiness for too many years. Most importantly, he apologized directly. "You loved my son when he had nothing," Charles told Claire quietly. "Most people in our world only loved what he owned. I failed to recognize the difference." Claire listened carefully. Then she asked the question haunting her constantly. "What happens now?" Charles looked toward her stomach thoughtfully. "Now we stop treating this child like a scandal and start treating it like family." Meanwhile, in Chicago, Ethan sat beside Lake Michigan, waiting anxiously for updates. When Charles finally called hours later, Ethan answered immediately. "How did it go?" Silence lingered briefly, then Charles surprised him again. "She's stronger than I expected." Ethan closed his eyes in relief. "Did Claire forgive you?" Charles gave a quiet laugh. "Not completely, but she listened." Another pause followed. "Your mother wants to meet her too." That news shocked Ethan almost as much as the apology itself. Evelyn Cole avoided emotional conflict whenever possible. Elegant, composed, and deeply loyal to family image, she spent years supporting Charles's decisions publicly, even while privately disagreeing sometimes. The fact she now wanted involvement changed everything. 2 weeks later, Ethan returned permanently to Cleveland. Not secretly this time. No disguises, no fake identity. Paparazzi followed briefly after discovering his relationship with Claire officially. News channels speculated endlessly about the billionaire heir abandoning elite society for a bookstore employee from Ohio. Yet surprisingly, public reaction wasn't entirely negative. Working-class Americans related deeply to Ethan's story after media uncovered details about his months living anonymously as a transit worker. Videos surfaced online showing Ethan helping elderly passengers and working exhausting bus routes during winter storms. Suddenly, millions viewed him differently, not merely privileged, human. Claire struggled adjusting to attention initially. Reporters occasionally appeared outside the bookstore. Strangers recognized her in grocery stores. Internet commentators criticized everything from her clothing to her background. Some called her manipulative, others praised her authenticity. The pressure became overwhelming quickly. One evening, Claire finally broke down crying beside Ethan inside their apartment. "I don't belong in this life," she whispered. Ethan pulled her carefully against his chest. "Neither do I anymore," he admitted quietly. She looked up through tears. "What does that mean?" Ethan hesitated before answering. "It means I spent years building hotels and investment portfolios while forgetting why success matters in the first place." The following month, Ethan shocked both business media and his family again. During a major Chicago shareholder meeting, he announced dramatic restructuring plans for Cole Enterprises. Executive bonuses would decrease substantially. Worker wages across hotels and service divisions would rise. Healthcare benefits expanded. Housing assistance programs introduced. Board members reacted like he announced economic suicide. One furious investor stood publicly. "You're running a corporation, not a charity." Ethan answered calmly. "No, I'm finally running a corporation like human beings matter inside it." News coverage exploded nationally afterward. Some analysts praised Ethan as visionary. Others called him reckless. Yet something unexpected happened over time. Employee productivity increased dramatically. Public support strengthened. Customers respected the company more. Even skeptical investors slowly admitted the changes weren't destroying profits. They were improving loyalty. One evening, after another exhausting media interview, Ethan returned to Cleveland emotionally drained. Claire sat reading quietly near the window while rain fell outside. She looked up, smiling softly when he entered. "Long day?" Ethan collapsed beside her tiredly. "I spent 2 hours explaining to millionaires why workers deserve health care." Claire laughed gently. "Sounds miserable." He looked toward her stomach thoughtfully. "Worth it, though." Several months later, during a routine ultrasound appointment, doctors discovered something unexpected. Claire wasn't carrying one baby. She was carrying twins. The news stunned everyone. Ethan laughed so hard inside the clinic, he nearly cried afterward. Charles Cole actually sat down abruptly from shock. Even Evelyn Cole smiled openly for the first time around Claire. As the pregnancy progressed, family dynamics changed completely. Charles visited Cleveland regularly now, often bringing ridiculous expensive gifts Claire politely refused accepting. Evelyn helped organize medical care quietly, without controlling everything. Margaret eventually admitted privately that she never expected wealthy people capable of changing this much. Still, fear remained beneath the happiness, because late one snowy evening during Claire's 7th month, doctors discovered dangerous complications threatening both babies. And suddenly, every healed relationship faced the possibility of devastating loss. Snow covered Cleveland again by the time doctors discovered the complications. The hospital room felt painfully silent after the specialist finished explaining everything. Claire sat motionless on the examination bed while Ethan gripped her hand tightly enough to hurt. "The twins are under significant stress," the doctor said carefully. "Claire's blood pressure keeps rising dangerously. If conditions worsen, we'll need emergency delivery earlier than expected." Fear settled instantly across the room. Ethan asked questions rapidly while trying to remain calm. "Are they going to survive?" The doctor hesitated. "We're doing everything possible, but the next several weeks are critical." Critical. Ethan hated that word immediately. Outside the hospital, snow drifted heavily beneath streetlights while ambulance sirens echoed faintly through downtown Cleveland. The entire drive home passed silently. Claire finally spoke halfway through the trip. "You look terrified." Ethan kept his eyes fixed on the icy road. "Because I am." Claire reached for his hand gently. "We're going to be okay." But her voice sounded uncertain too. Over the following days, life narrowed into hospital visits, medication schedules, and constant anxiety. Claire was ordered onto near-complete bed rest. Ethan cancelled major business meetings immediately despite investor outrage. Nothing mattered more than protecting his family now. Charles and Evelyn arrived in Cleveland almost daily afterward. Charles surprised everyone most. The once intimidating businessman spent hours quietly assembling nursery furniture inside Claire and Ethan's apartment. He carried groceries upstairs personally. He even learned how to cook simple meals after Evelyn mocked his terrible kitchen skills relentlessly. One snowy evening, Ethan walked into the apartment and stopped in complete shock. Charles Cole sat cross-legged on the floor beside half-finished cribs while arguing with instruction manuals. "I thought billionaires hired people for this," Ethan joked weakly. Charles looked up irritably. These instructions were clearly written by idiots. For the first time in years, Ethan genuinely laughed with his father. Later that night, after Claire finally fell asleep, Ethan found Charles standing alone beside the apartment window, watching snow fall silently across the city. "You love her," Charles said quietly without turning around. Ethan nodded immediately. "More than anything." Charles remained silent briefly, then he admitted something Ethan never expected hearing. "I'm jealous of you sometimes." Ethan frowned slightly. "Why?" Charles stared toward distant city lights. "Because you were brave enough to choose happiness before it became too late." Those words stayed with Ethan afterward. 2 weeks later, disaster struck suddenly. Claire collapsed during breakfast. One moment she laughed softly at something Margaret said. The next, pain twisted violently across her face before she nearly fell unconscious. Everything afterward blurred into panic. Sirens, doctors shouting, snow-covered streets racing past hospital windows. Ethan sat beside Claire's bed, gripping her hand while medical staff prepared emergency surgery. A nurse explained complications quickly. But Ethan barely heard anything beyond one terrifying sentence. "We may need to save the babies early to protect Claire's life." Hours felt endless afterward. Evelyn cried quietly in the waiting room, while Margaret prayed continuously beside her. Charles paced the hallway like a man losing a war against something money could not control. For once, power meant absolutely nothing. Finally, a surgeon emerged, still wearing protective gear. Everyone stood instantly. The doctor's exhausted smile changed everything. "Claire survived surgery," he announced first. Ethan nearly collapsed from relief. "And the twins? Premature but stable, 2 girls. They're in neonatal care currently, but both are fighting hard." Tears filled Ethan's eyes immediately. 2 daughters. Alive. The following hours became emotional chaos. Claire drifted in and out of consciousness while nurses monitored her carefully. Ethan finally saw his daughters through neonatal incubator glass shortly after midnight. Tiny, fragile, perfect. One baby squeezed his finger weakly through the incubator opening. And suddenly Ethan understood something completely. Everything he once valued before Cleveland felt meaningless now. Luxury hotels, corporate influence, private jets. None of it compared to this moment. Charles entered the neonatal unit quietly beside him. For several minutes, father and son simply stared at the babies together. Then Charles cleared his throat awkwardly. "They're beautiful." Ethan smiled through tears. "Yeah, they are." Charles looked unusually emotional himself. "I spent decades building an empire thinking legacy meant buildings and money." He paused quietly. "Turns out, legacy looks more like this." Weeks passed slowly afterward. Claire recovered gradually while the twins grew stronger inside neonatal care. The hospital became their entire world temporarily. Nurses joked that Ethan practically lived there full-time. News media eventually discovered the emergency delivery, but surprisingly, public reaction remained compassionate rather than invasive. Thousands of ordinary Americans sent letters and gifts after following Ethan and Claire's story for months. Transit workers from Cleveland organized donations quietly for families with premature babies. Bookstore employees across Ohio mailed children's novels for the twins. One afternoon, Ethan sat reading through handwritten cards while Claire rested beside him. "People can be unbelievably kind sometimes," Claire whispered. Ethan looked toward their sleeping daughters nearby. "I forgot that for a long time." By early spring, doctors finally allowed the twins home. The apartment transformed completely afterward. Sleepless nights, endless diapers, tiny cries echoing through rooms at impossible hours. Yet despite exhaustion, happiness filled every corner. One quiet evening, several months later, Ethan returned from Chicago after finalizing major company reforms, permanently transferring executive headquarters partly into Cleveland. Claire sat near the window feeding one daughter while the other slept against Margaret's shoulder. Warm sunset light filled the apartment softly. Ethan stopped near the doorway, overwhelmed suddenly by gratitude. Claire noticed immediately. "What?" Ethan walked toward them slowly. "I almost lost all this before understanding what actually mattered." Claire smiled gently. "But you didn't lose it." Ethan kissed her forehead carefully. "No," he whispered, "I found it instead." At that exact moment, his phone buzzed loudly inside his jacket. "Marcus," Ethan answered casually at first, then his expression changed completely. Claire sat upright instantly. "What happened?" Ethan lowered the phone slowly, shock visible across his face. "Dad collapsed during a board meeting in Chicago." Silence filled the apartment. Then Ethan grabbed his coat immediately. Because suddenly, the man who once nearly destroyed his happiness might be dying before Ethan ever fully repaired their relationship. Ethan reached Chicago shortly before midnight. Rain hammered the hospital windows while doctors moved quickly through bright corridors, smelling of antiseptic and exhaustion. Charles Cole had suffered a massive cardiac episode during a shareholder meeting. The same powerful man who once controlled entire industries now lay unconscious beneath machines keeping him alive. Ethan stopped outside the intensive care room feeling suddenly terrified. Not because he hated his father, because despite everything between them, he still loved him. Evelyn sat nearby, wrapped in silence and fear. The elegant composure she carried for decades had completely fallen apart. When she saw Ethan approaching, tears filled her eyes immediately. "The doctors say stress finally caught him," she whispered. Ethan looked through the glass toward his father. Charles appeared smaller somehow, human, fragile. For years, Ethan viewed him like an unshakable force rather than an aging man carrying regrets heavier than wealth. The next 48 hours became brutal. Doctors stabilized Charles temporarily before complications returned repeatedly. Business executives flooded the hospital, demanding updates while reporters gathered outside continuously. Ethan ignored all of them. Nothing mattered except family now. Late one evening, Ethan finally entered the intensive care room alone. Machines beeped steadily beside the bed while rain streaked across dark windows overlooking Chicago. Charles opened his eyes weakly as Ethan approached. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Charles gave a faint, exhausted smile. Guess my heart finally filed complaints against me. Ethan laughed quietly, despite tears threatening already. You scared everyone half to death. Charles looked toward the ceiling briefly. Maybe I deserved it. Ethan pulled a chair closer beside the bed. Don't say that. Silence settled gently between them afterward. Then Charles surprised Ethan one final time. I need you to promise something, he whispered. Anything. Charles turned slowly toward his son. Don't become me. Ethan frowned painfully. Dad, listen carefully. Charles struggled for breath before continuing. I spent my entire life protecting buildings instead of relationships. By the time I understood the difference, decades were already gone. Tears gathered inside Ethan's eyes. Charles looked at him steadily. You already found what I lost. Don't sacrifice it trying to prove yourself worthy of this family name. Ethan gripped his father's hand tightly. You still have time to fix things too. Charles smiled sadly. Maybe. His eyes closed briefly from exhaustion. Bring Claire and the girls tomorrow. I'd like to see my granddaughters again. The following afternoon, Claire arrived carrying one baby while Evelyn carried the other, carefully behind her. Charles looked genuinely emotional seeing them. The powerful businessman who once valued image above everything now cried openly, watching two tiny girls sleeping against their mother's shoulders. Claire approached the bed quietly. They've gotten bigger already, she whispered. Charles nodded weakly. Beautiful too. One baby suddenly opened sleepy eyes while Charles gently touched her tiny hand. The old man's face softened completely. What's her name again? Lily, Claire answered softly. And her sister is Emma. Charles repeated the names quietly like precious things. For the first time in years, peace entered the hospital room. Over the next several weeks, Charles slowly recovered. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. The experience changed him deeply afterward. He retired officially from active leadership at Cole Enterprises and transferred major authority permanently to Ethan. Yet Ethan no longer ran the company like traditional corporate royalty. Cleveland became headquarters for several new humanitarian initiatives supporting transit workers, struggling families, and healthcare access programs across Ohio and Illinois. Claire helped organize community outreach personally. Her bookstore background made her approachable in ways executives never understood. People trusted her immediately. Together, Ethan and Claire transformed parts of the company into something unexpectedly human. Years passed. The twins grew energetic and fearless. Charles became the kind of grandfather Ethan never imagined possible. Evelyn spent weekends baking terrible cookies while pretending recipes mattered more than family laughter. And every winter, Ethan still visited Cleveland transit stations quietly. Not because he missed suffering, because he never wanted forgetting to happen again. One snowy evening, nearly 5 years after everything changed, Ethan stood beside the exact bus stop where he first noticed Claire beneath the street lamp. The city looked different now. Cleaner. Stronger. Or maybe he simply saw it differently. Claire approached carrying coffee while Lily and Emma argued loudly about snowflakes nearby. You disappeared again, Claire teased softly. Ethan smiled, just remembering things. She slipped her hand into his. Any regrets? Ethan looked toward his daughters, laughing beneath falling snow, then toward Claire, the woman who loved him before wealth mattered. The woman who survived deception, pressure, heartbreak, and fear beside him. The woman who taught him dignity existed far beyond money. Only one, Ethan admitted quietly. Claire raised an eyebrow. What's that? He kissed her forehead gently. That I wasted so many years searching for meaning in the wrong places. Snow drifted softly around them while traffic moved through Cleveland's glowing winter streets. For a long moment, Ethan simply stood there, holding the life he almost destroyed before understanding its value. Years earlier, he disguised himself as an ordinary transit worker, hoping to test whether real love still existed. Instead, he discovered something far greater. Real love had never cared about status in the first place. It cared about truth, about sacrifice, about showing up when life became difficult and standing there beneath the falling snow with Claire beside him and their daughters laughing nearby, Ethan finally understood something completely. The richest moment of his life arrived only after he stopped measuring wealth in dollars. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share this video.